When I asked my neighbor Ethan to help fix my front door, I never imagined it would unlock something far more dangerous than just a jammed hinge. What happens when one small favor spirals into a connection so electrifying that it threatens everything you thought you knew about loyalty and love? Before you dive into this tangled story of temptation and betrayal, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. This is a door you'll never forget opening. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The sound of the door scraping against the frame was maddening. I tugged at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge more than a few inches. The midday sun poured into the hallway, lighting up the dust particles that floated lazily in the air. Frustration mounted as I gave one final yank, only to stumble backward when it didn't move an inch. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, already damp from the effort. That's when I saw Ethan through the window, a shadow passing on his porch, a beer in hand, looking effortlessly relaxed as usual. My neighbor, the one everyone in the cul-de-sac talked about. "Ethan?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. He turned at the sound of my voice, his expression softening into a smile. He always had that effect, a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world worth listening to. "Maria?" he greeted, nodding as he leaned against his porch railing. "What's got you so worked up?" "The stupid front door," I gestured behind me. "It's stuck again. I think the frame's warped. You wouldn't happen to know how to fix something like that, would you?" His lips curved into a smirk, his eyes twinkling in that infuriatingly confident way of his. "Lucky for you, I'm a man of many talents." Before I could second-guess asking, Ethan had already put down his beer and hopped off the porch. He strolled over, his faded t-shirt clinging slightly to his chest in the heat. I tried not to notice, tried not to think about how different he was from Mark, my husband, who was halfway across the country on another one of his endless work trips. Ethan crouched down to inspect the door, running his hand along the edges of the frame with an ease that made me feel self-conscious about my earlier struggle. "Looks like the wood's swollen from the humidity," he said, glancing back at me. "Nothing a little elbow grease can't fix." I watched as he grabbed a toolbox from his porch and returned, the sight of him rolling up his sleeves stirring something I couldn't quite name. He knelt by the door, his hands deftly working to adjust the hinges. "So, what's Mark up to this time?" he asked casually, not looking up. "Another business trip," I replied, the words coming out more bitter than I intended. "Boston, I think. Or maybe it was Chicago. It's hard to keep track." In the car, Ethan paused, his wrench hovering mid-air as he looked at me. "That's rough. Must get lonely." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. "It's fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm used to it." "Oh." He didn't press, but the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Finally, he stood, wiping his hands on a rag and giving the door an experimental tug. It swung open smoothly. "There. Good as new. You're a lifesaver," I said, genuinely grateful. "I don't know how I'd survive without you around." Ethan chuckled, his gaze lingering on me for a beat longer than necessary. "Glad I could help. Though, if you want to thank me, I wouldn't say no to a cold drink." The suggestion caught me off guard, but before I could overthink it, I nodded. "Come on in." Inside, the house felt too quiet, too still. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and handed one to Ethan, who had made himself comfortable at the kitchen counter. He leaned back, the picture of ease, while I stayed standing, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "So," he said, taking a sip, "how long has Mark been gone this time?" "A week," I replied, fiddling with the edge of my glass. "You'll be back tomorrow." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Must be tough being on your own so much. It's just how things are, I said, shrugging. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of them. How often had I told myself that? How often had I convinced myself it was enough? Ethan tilted his head, studying me. You deserve more than that, you know. So I froze, unsure how to respond. The sincerity in his voice threw me off balance. I looked away, focusing on a smudge on the counter that suddenly seemed very important. You're always so put together, Ethan continued, his tone softer now. Always taking care of everything. I guess I just wonder, who's taking care of you? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Before I could say anything, Ethan stood, setting his glass down with a soft clink. Anyway, I should get going, he said, his voice lighter now, as if sensing he'd pushed too far. Thanks for the tea. I followed him to the door, my mind racing. Ethan! He turned, his expression open, waiting. Thanks again for the door. His lips quirked into a small smile. Anytime. As he walked back to his house, I stood in the doorway, watching him go. The air felt thicker than it had before, charged with something I couldn't name. I leaned against the doorframe, my hand brushing against the edge of the door he'd just fixed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been restless, my thoughts circling back to Ethan and the conversation we'd had. His words echoed in my mind. Who's taking care of you? I had brushed them off at the time, but they lingered, needling at parts of me I had long ignored. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, absently watching the street. My gaze drifted to Ethan's house. His truck was parked in the driveway, and for a brief moment I wondered if he was still asleep. What was he like in the quiet hours of the morning? Did he wake up slowly, or was he the type to spring out of bed, ready for the day? I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts, but just as I turned away, his front door opened, and there he was. He was dressed casually, his hair still damp from a shower, and he carried a toolbox in one hand. When he glanced up and saw me watching, he gave a small wave. I felt a flicker of embarrassment, but raised my hand in return. Before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the window. Good morning. Morning, he replied, his smile easy. Need another door fixed? I laughed despite myself. Not today. Too bad, he said, leaning casually against his porch railing. I was starting to think I'd found my new calling. The light-hearted banter eased some of the tension I'd been feeling, but there was something about the way he looked at me, steady and unhurried, that made my stomach flip. I set my coffee down, suddenly feeling the need to be busy. I actually have this broken kitchen drawer, I found myself saying. It's been stuck for weeks, and I keep forgetting to fix it. Kitchen drawers are a specialty of mine, Ethan said, his grin widening. Want me to take a look? Bring me back my fogies. Before I could overthink it, I nodded. Sure, if you're not busy. Give me 5 minutes. As promised, Ethan showed up at my door minutes later, toolbox in hand. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the space in a way that made me both nervous and something else. I pointed to the offending drawer, and he got to work, crouching down to inspect it. This should be easy, he said, glancing up at me. Just a loose track. Happens all the time. I watched as he worked, the way his hands moved with practiced ease. He had a kind of focus that was almost mesmerizing. I busied myself by tidying up the counters, but my attention kept drifting back to him. "So, how long have you lived here?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "About 6 months," he replied, not looking up. "Moved here after the divorce. Needed a fresh start, you know?" I nodded, even though I didn't really know. My life had been the opposite of a fresh start. Routine, predictable, sometimes stifling. "What about you?" he asked, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. "How long have you been in this house?" 10 years, I said. "Mark and I bought it right after we got married." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Seems like a nice place to settle down." "It is," I said, but the words felt hollow. I looked away, fiddling with a dish towel. Ethan didn't press, but his silence felt like an invitation to keep talking. "It's just, I guess it hasn't really felt like home for a while. Mark's gone so much, and when he's here, it's like he's still somewhere else, you know." I hadn't meant to say so much, but the words came spilling out before I could stop them. Ethan leaned against the counter, his expression softening. "I get it," he said simply. "Sometimes the people we're closest to can feel the farthest away." His understanding felt like a balm, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. The drawer forgotten, we stood there talking. About everything and nothing. He told me about his job, his childhood in the Midwest, how he'd ended up here. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks, and the sound felt foreign but good. When I reached for my coffee mug, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled back quickly, my cheeks warming. Ethan's gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I could see the question in his eyes, the same question that was racing through my mind. Before either of us could say anything, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, the spell between us breaking. Ethan stepped back as I went to answer it. It was the neighbor from 2 doors down, an older woman named Linda, who always seemed to know everyone's business. She gave me a tight smile, her eyes darting to Ethan in the background. "Just wanted to drop off these flyers," she said, holding up a stack of papers. "The neighborhood association is organizing a block party next weekend." "Thanks," I said, taking them from her. Her gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment longer before she turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Well, I won't keep you. See you around." I closed the door, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite pinpoint. When I turned back to Ethan, he was packing up his tools, his expression carefully neutral. "Looks like the drawer's all fixed," he said. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer now. "You didn't have to do all that." "I didn't mind," he replied. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say more. But then he picked up his toolbox and headed for the door. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." I stood there after he left, the house feeling emptier than it had before. The air still carried the faintest trace of his cologne, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, I wasn't sure. The day after Ethan fixed the drawer, I couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in my chest, a mix of anticipation, guilt, and something dangerously close to excitement. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing had happened, and nothing would happen. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less certain I became. By mid-morning, I found myself glancing out the window more than I cared to admit, hoping for a glimpse of Ethan. It wasn't until early afternoon that I saw him, working on his truck in the driveway. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and his hair fell messily across his forehead. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, holding a pitcher of lemonade as my excuse. "Thought you could use a break," I said, my voice too light to be casual. Ethan glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. His smile was warm, easy. "You read my mind." I poured him a glass, watching as he took a long sip. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and I had to look away, focusing on a bird perched on the fence instead. "You're too good to me," he said, setting the glass down and leaning against the truck. His words were teasing, but there was an undercurrent to them that made my pulse quicken. "Oh, just being neighborly," I replied, trying to keep my tone breezy. Ethan tilted his head, studying me. "You're a lot more neighborly than most people around here." I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze, and I busied myself pouring another glass. "Well, someone has to keep you in line." He chuckled, a deep, rich sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're doing a good job of it." The silence that followed was charged, the air between us thick with something unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, I found him watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Maria," he said softly, taking a step closer. His voice was low, almost tentative. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Are you happy?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Was I happy? The answer should have been simple, but the truth was far more complicated. The truth was far more complicated. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I think I am, and then other times—" Ethan nodded as if he understood, his eyes never leaving mine. "You deserve to be," he said. "Happy, I mean." The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear. I looked away, my gaze falling to the lemonade pitcher in my hands. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe you're just making it harder than it needs to be." I didn't have a chance to respond because, at that moment, his hand brushed against mine. It was a small gesture, accidental maybe, but it sent a jolt through me so strong I nearly dropped the pitcher. I pulled back quickly, my breath hitching. I started, but Ethan cut me off. "Maria, wait." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. He stepped closer, his expression conflicted. "I know I shouldn't say this, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a freight train, the weight of them knocking the air from my lungs. "Ethan," I whispered, shaking my head. "We can't." "I know," he said quickly, "I know. But that doesn't change how I feel." I took a step back, putting distance between us even as my heart ached to stay close. "This isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling, "not to Mark, not to you, and not to me." Ethan didn't argue, but his eyes held a quiet desperation that made it hard to look at him. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Turning on my heel, I walked back to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The next few days were a blur of routine tasks and restless nights. I avoided Ethan as best as I could, but the tension simmered beneath the surface, refusing to be ignored. It didn't help that Linda, my nosy neighbor, had taken a sudden interest in my comings and goings. I'd caught her watching me from her porch more than once, her expression a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Things came to a head one evening when Mark called unexpectedly. I was folding laundry in the bedroom, the faint hum of the TV in the background, when my phone buzzed. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I wasn't expecting you to call." "Thought I'd surprise you," he said, his tone warm but distracted. "How's everything going?" "Fine," I replied automatically, just the usual. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the faint clatter of dishes in the background. "You sure everything's okay? You sound off." I hesitated, my grip tightening on the phone. "I'm fine," I said finally. "Just tired, I guess." "Okay," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "I'll be home tomorrow, by the way. My meeting got canceled, so I'm catching an earlier flight." My heart skipped a beat, panic flaring in my chest. "Oh, that's great." He said, and for a moment, the silence between us felt like a chasm. "I miss you." "I miss you too," I said, the words feeling hollow in my mouth. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in my hand. Mark was coming home, and I wasn't sure how to face him with the weight of everything that had happened hanging over me. The following day, Mark arrived earlier than expected, catching me off guard as I was tidying up the living room. He swept me into a hug, his cologne filling my senses, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, so sharp it nearly took my breath away. "It's good to be home," he said, his smile warm but tired. I nodded, forcing a smile in return. "It's good to have you back." But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was watching me more closely than usual. His questions were casual enough, how I'd been, what I'd been up to, but there was an edge to his tone that made my skin prickle. At one point, as we sat on the couch watching TV, he turned to me suddenly. "You sure everything's okay?" "Why wouldn't it be?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You just seem different." The words hit harder than they should have, and I looked away, focusing on the flickering screen. "I'm fine, Mark. Really." He didn't push further, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. Later that night, after Mark had gone to bed, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness. Ethan's house was dark, the truck absent from the driveway. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. The sound of Mark stirring upstairs brought me back to reality. I turned away from the window, my heart heavy with the weight of the choices I had yet to make. "Would you like me to continue into the resolution, 1,000 words? He said, "Yes." ChatGPT said, Act 4, Resolution, 1,000 words. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. Mark had already left for his morning run, a habit he always maintained regardless of where he was. I sat at the kitchen table with my mug, staring out the window at the empty street. The tension from the past few days hung over me like a cloud, and I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. By mid-afternoon, I found myself walking the familiar path to Ethan's house. My heart pounded with every step, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say, but couldn't quite form into words. When I reached his porch, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. Just as I was about to press it, the door swung open. "Maria," Ethan said, his surprise quickly morphing into concern. "Everything okay?" I nodded, though my heart felt like it was about to burst. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, letting me in without a word. The living room was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands twisting in my lap. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice trembling. "The secrets, the guilt, it's tearing me apart." Ethan sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "I never wanted to make things harder for you," he said softly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what I'm doing, Ethan. I don't know what I want." "That's okay," he said, leaning forward. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. But you do need to figure out what makes you happy." His words hit me harder than I expected, tears springing to my eyes. "I don't even know what that is anymore." Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. The gesture was comforting, but it only made the ache in my chest grow stronger. "You'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "And when you do, I'll be here. Whatever you need." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I think I need to focus on my marriage, on Mark." Ethan's hand slipped away, but he didn't pull back completely. "If that's what you want, then I'll support you. But promise me one thing." "However," I whispered, "don't settle for a life that makes you unhappy." When I got home, the house was quiet. Mark was in his office, the faint hum of his computer filtering through the closed door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, gathering my courage before knocking softly. "Come in," he called. I pushed the door open, finding him hunched over his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when he saw me, his expression softening. "Hey, what's up?" "I need to talk to you," I said, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. My hands felt clammy, and my stomach twisted with nerves. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharpening. "What about us?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "I feel like we've been drifting apart, like we're living two separate lives." His expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on work, and I guess I thought you were okay with it." "Oh, I was," I said. Or at least, I told myself I was. But the truth is, I've been lonely, Mark. And it's not just about you being gone all the time. It's about how we are when you're here. Mark rubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging. "I never wanted to make you feel like this. I thought I was doing what was best for us, for our future." "I know you meant well," I said. "But I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. We need to fix this, Mark. Together." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're right. I've been selfish, Maria. I've taken you for granted, and I'm sorry. You hurt." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I'm not perfect either," I admitted. "I've made mistakes too." Mark frowned, his eyes searching mine. "What kind of mistakes?" I hesitated, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. "Nothing happened," I said carefully. "But I've been struggling, and I let myself get too close to someone else." His jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. "Do you still feel anything for them?" I shook my head, the words coming out thick with emotion. "No. What I feel is for you, Mark, but I need us to be better. I need us to be a team again." He exhaled slowly, his tension easing slightly. Then let's fix this." he said. I don't want to lose you, Maria. Except, he admitted abruptly, I guess it wasn't a question. Yeah. The words were a balm to my frayed nerves, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but we were finally on the same page. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I stared at the ceiling, my mind restless. I had taken the first step toward rebuilding my marriage, but I knew the journey ahead would be long and uncertain. Ethan's words echoed in my mind. Don't settle for a life that makes you unhappy. I wasn't sure what happiness looked like anymore, but I was determined to find it, one step at a time. The days that followed were a tentative dance between Mark and me. He was making an effort. I could see it in the little things. The way he stayed home later in the mornings to have coffee with me, how he asked about my day with genuine interest, and the way he reached for my hand when we walked together in the evenings. It was comforting, even if it felt unfamiliar after so many years of drifting apart. But with each gesture of his, I found myself fighting a quiet war within. Could we really rebuild what we'd lost? And, more troubling, did I even want to? My heart felt split, tethered to the comfort of my marriage on one side and the lingering thoughts of Ethan on the other. A week after Mark's return, the neighborhood block party that Linda had been so insistent about finally arrived. Mark and I walked over together, his hand on the small of my back as we joined the gathering crowd. Linda greeted us with her usual saccharine smile, her eyes sharp as they darted between us. Maria, Mark, she said, clapping her hands together. You two are such a lovely couple. It's great to see you out together. Her tone was pleasant enough, but there was something in her gaze that made my stomach twist. I felt Mark's arm tighten around me, and I forced a smile. Thanks, Linda, I said. It's nice to get out of the house. The smell of grilled burgers and the sound of laughter filled the air as we made our way through the party. Mark seemed at ease, chatting with neighbors and joking with the kids running around. I tried to focus on the moment, but my thoughts kept drifting to the house 2 doors down. Ethan was there, leaning casually against a tree, a beer in hand. He hadn't seen me yet, and I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. But then his eyes found mine across the lawn, and the air between us seemed to shift. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just held my gaze for a moment before looking away. Mark noticed, his brow furrowing slightly. Who's that? He asked, gesturing subtly in Ethan's direction. That's Ethan, I said, keeping my voice even. He moved in a few months ago. Mark nodded, his expression neutral. He seems familiar. Before I could respond, Linda appeared again, her voice cutting through the tension. Ethan, come over and meet Maria's husband. My heart sank as Ethan made his way over, his steps measured. He extended a hand to Mark, his expression polite but distant. Ethan Miller, he said. Nice to meet you. Mark Collins, my husband replied, shaking his hand firmly. So, you're new to the neighborhood? Relatively, Ethan said. His tone was calm, his posture relaxed, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension between them. Maria's been kind enough to help me get settled. Mark's eyes flicked to mine, a question lurking behind them. Has she? I opened my mouth to respond, but Ethan beat me to it. She's been a great neighbor, he said smoothly, always willing to lend a hand. My jaw trembled as I waited for him to add something. The conversation was mercifully interrupted by a burst of laughter from a group nearby, and Ethan excused himself, leaving Mark and me standing in awkward silence. He seems nice, Mark said finally, his tone carefully neutral. He is, I said, my voice tight. He's been through a lot, but he's a good guy. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on me. I get the sense you know him pretty well. There was no accusation in his voice, but the implication was clear. My heart raced as I struggled to find the right words. He's a friend, I said carefully. Nothing more. Mark didn't respond right away, his gaze shifting back to where Ethan stood. Good, he said finally, because I don't think I could handle losing you. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, the weight of everything we'd been through hit me all at once. You're not going to lose me, I said, reaching for his hand. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I believed them. The next day, I found myself standing at Ethan's door again, my heart heavy with indecision. I hadn't planned on coming, but the pull to see him one last time was too strong to ignore. When he opened the door, his expression was a mix of surprise and resignation. Maria, he said, what are you doing here? I needed to talk to you, I said, stepping inside. The air between us felt charged, the unspoken words hanging like a storm cloud. End note. I think I already know what you're going to say, Ethan said, his voice quiet. I hesitated, my throat tight. I can't do this, Ethan. I can't keep lying to myself, to Mark, to you. I broke off. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. I figured as much. This isn't about you, I said quickly. It's about me. I need to figure out who I am and what I want before I can make any decisions. And you think you'll find that with Mark? Ethan asked, his tone not unkind, but heavy with sadness. I don't know, I admitted, but I have to try, for both our sakes. Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. I understand. I just hope you find what you're looking for. I reached out, my hand brushing his arm. Thank you for everything. He covered my hand with his own, his touch warm but fleeting. Take care of yourself, Maria. When I got home, Mark was waiting for me in the living room. He looked up as I walked in, his expression cautious. Where were you? Out for a walk, I said, my voice steady. Mark didn't press, but the question lingered in his eyes. I sat down beside him, the weight of the day settling over me. We need to be honest with each other, I said finally, about everything. Mark nodded, his hand reaching for mine. I'm ready if you are. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we might actually have a chance to find our way back to each other. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face, his quiet strength, his unwavering support. The path ahead was uncertain, but for now, it was mine to walk. The day passed slowly, a blur of mundane tasks and lingering thoughts. Mark stayed close, his presence a constant reminder of the choices I had made. He offered to cook dinner that evening, a rare occurrence that made me smile despite myself. As he moved around the kitchen, chopping vegetables and humming under his breath, I felt a flicker of hope. But even as I watched him, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. The way he had looked at me during the block party, the quiet strength in his voice when he told me to take care of myself. I hadn't realized how much I had come to rely on him, not just for the excitement he brought into my life, but for the way he made me feel seen. I tried to push those thoughts aside as we sat down to dinner, focusing instead on the meal Mark had prepared. He was making an effort, and I owed it to him and to myself to meet him halfway. This is good, I said, gesturing to the plate in front of me, Where did you learn to cook like this?" He chuckled, a hint of sheepishness in his expression. "YouTube, mostly. I figured it was time to expand my skills." I smiled, appreciating the gesture. Well, it paid off. For a moment, it felt like old times, like the early days of our marriage when we would laugh and talk for hours without any effort. But even as I clung to that feeling, I knew it wasn't enough. Something fundamental had shifted, and no amount of small talk could fix it. Later that night, after Mark had gone to bed, I found myself standing at the window in the living room, staring out into the dark. The street was quiet, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lamp posts. Ethan's house was dark, his truck absent from the driveway. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, and whether he was thinking about me. I hated myself for wondering. I hated the way his absence felt like a weight in my chest, even as I tried to focus on rebuilding my marriage. But most of all, I hated the uncertainty that had taken root inside me, the nagging question of whether I was choosing the right path. I had made a choice. Mark's voice startled me out of my thoughts. "Can't sleep?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Just thinking," I said, wrapping my arms around myself. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "About us?" "About everything," I admitted. "Mark, I need you to know something. I don't want to hurt you, but I need to be honest." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. I got close to someone else. It wasn't physical, but it could have been. And it made me realize how much we've been missing. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Ethan?" he asked, his voice steady. I nodded, my throat tight. It wasn't his fault. I let it happen because I was looking for something I felt like I'd lost. And Mark closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. When he opened them again, there was pain there, but also resolve. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I don't like it, but I'd rather know the truth than keep pretending everything's fine." "I want to fix this," I said, my voice breaking. "I want us to work." "So do I," he said. "But it's going to take time, and we both have to be all in." I nodded, tears slipping down my cheeks. "I am." He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself lean into him, hoping against hope that it would be enough. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and an aching sadness. Mark and I were trying, but the road ahead felt uncertain. I thought of Ethan, his parting words echoing in my mind. "Don't settle for a life that makes you unhappy." I didn't know what happiness looked like yet, but I knew I had to find it. Whether it was with Mark, or on my own, or on some path I hadn't yet discovered, I owed it to myself to try. For now, all I could do was take it one day at a time.